first party to go away was A Force, that sailed by ship to Tavoy in Burma, and they worked on a railway, and then they went to a place called To Tanbaya, which was the start of the Burma end of the railway. B Force went to Borneo, and C Force was sent to Japan. And then one of my friends said, because food was getting pretty short in Singapore, he said, I'm going to volunteer for the next force. And we said, don't volunteer for anything in the army. But he volunteered, and he was on a small force called E Force, which was sent to Borneo to reinforce B Force, and he was one of the unfortunate ones that died on the death march from Sandakan to Ranau. Then we didn't realise it at the time, but things were getting a bit behind schedule with the railway, because the Japanese engineers were on a timetable to get the railway finished so they could supply their troops in Burma, because Allied and British submarines were sinking all their transports that had to go from Indochina right round the Malayan Peninsula and up into the Indian Ocean to get to Burma. And they were running behind schedule, so they wanted a major force. Now, they told our officers that because food was getting pretty short in Singapore, which was true, that they were going to send a large force up to Lower Thailand, which was a land of milk and honey, and that we'd be able to, because it was such a nice place, that sick men could be included in the force. So F Force consisted of 7,000 men, roughly half British and half Australians, of which a large number were sick men. And we were taken to Singapore railway station, and we were told that we could take anything we liked. And I had an old mortar box filled up with a bottle of salt that I'd got from reducing seawater, and some books on astronomy, and there was even a baby grand piano was taken in by truck, and it all got left on the station at Singapore. And then we boarded the rice trucks, which were a pretty shocking steel enclosed thing. And there wasn't enough room for everybody to lie down. There wasn't at times enough room for people to sit down. And of course the worst people had to be allowed to lie down, and the rest had to stand up. And we were about 3 days and nights on that, and you'd stop every now and again, and the people lined up there with some boiled rice for us, and you're allowed. If you wanted to go to the toilet during the trip, the only thing you could do was to slide the door open, and a couple of fellas would hold your hands while you pointed your backside out the door. Then we arrived at Bampong, and for a while we did think we were in the land of milk and honey, because we marched into this little camp, and there was a great big kwali there. It was filled up with vegetables and boiled eggs and a wonderful stew, and of course we hadn't eaten anything like that for a while, which had some deleterious effects on our stomach. And the natives were giving us bananas and boiled eggs. And the next morning, that's when we started off on our march, and we marched nearly 270, perhaps 300 kilometres to a place called Taimonta or Concoita, which was our first working spot. But on the way up, we followed a river called the Kwa Noi, and we only marched during the night time because they didn't want planes to observe what was happening. So we marched for 2 nights, rest during the day, and then on the 3rd night we'd rest the day and a night. And we were on this river one night, and we had all these little sores on our legs, and you go down to the river to have a wash, and there were little tiny fish, and they used to attack these sores, and they'd clean them up beautifully. But I put what little scrap of towel I had across this bush, and when I came out I dried myself off, and the next thing I know, my face swelled up like a watermelon, and my eyes were almost completely closed. I didn't know what the hell had happened to me. But apparently this sort of a bush was a bit like a stinging nettle, and it took about a day and a half for my face to get back to normal. But we used to, we camped one night, or stopped one night, and we had this big fire going, and a friend of mine took his boots off and tried to dry his socks near the fire, and when he put his socks back on, he felt this stinging sensation. So he pulled his shoes and socks off again, and there was this small scorpion was inside one of his socks. Luckily it was only a little one and it didn't cause him too much strife. But then when we arrived at our first camp, our first job was to build a bridge over a river, and that necessitated going into the jungle, cutting down trees, cutting the branches off and carrying them back to the roadway, and then getting them down to a barge where they were taken out, and they had to be driven into the riverbed by a pole driver, which was operated by about 20 or 30 men attached to one rope, which would bring the pole driver up and drop it on top of the the log of wood, and we had an officer who was our regimental sergeant major, who became a field appointment, Lieutenant Noel May, and we'd been at this pile driving. The Japanese used to say, "Each knee, son, 1, 2, 3," and then we were doing this for hour after hour, and Noel May decided we needed a rest, so he said to the Japanese, "Yasmai," which means rest, and the Japanese said, "Yasmai nai." And this officer happened to be an airline pilot with Japan Airlines, and he was home on leave from America, and he got caught up in Japan and put into the army. So Noel May said, "Well, they're going to have a rest," so he told us to stop. And the Japanese pulled out his revolver and stuck it in Noel's stomach and said, "If you don't tell them to start, I'll shoot you." And Noel said, "No, they're going to have a rest." So he said, "You're a brave man, all right, they can have 10 minutes rest." So after that we got 10 minutes in the hour rest. But that was the first indication of you know, just how tough things were going to be, because there are records where Japanese colonels get up and say, you know, "Nippon very sorry, many men must die."
Now, you just mentioned that you were building this bridge. What part of F Force were you a member of now? Were you now in Pond's Party?
Yeah, I was a member of Colonel Pond's Party.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me something about the people who were in that, like Roy Mills and...
Well, Roy Mills he was not only a gentleman, but he was a fantastic man, and he was a doctor, and anybody that knows anything about what the doctors did on the rail line, he suffered many beatings which affected him after he came home, but he ministered to us like an angel with very little medication, and he did what he could for people, and he was one of the outstanding members of that party.
Now, one of his offsiders was George Beecham.
Yeah, George Beecham. Yeah, George was a pretty typical Australian character, and I caught up with George when we came back home again, and he was in Melbourne. I think it was Melbourne, right? Was he?
New South Wales.
New South Wales. I remember getting up with George Beecham.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I remember George Beecham, yes.
Yeah.
He,
and we'll just stop this for a minute. Now we've spoken about Roy Mills, the regimental medical officer, and his orderly, George Beecham. Do you remember any of the other orderlies? Lex Arthurson, by any chance?
No, I can't remember that. No, I didn't really get involved with the medical side of it until we got up into so-called hospital camp in Tanbaya in Burma. I was just working on the parties.
Well, what about this bridge that you said you were building?
Yeah.
Have you got a copy of Roy Mills's book?
No.
No. Okay. It was just that he had a sketch of a bridge on the front of it, and I just wondered if it was the same one.
It could have been their number. Yeah.
Do you recall anything about the building the bridge in particular? Well, people moving over it, or
the point of cutting these trees down in the jungle and dragging them down to the roadway.
Yeah.
When the tree was cut down and trimmed off, it had to be carried down to the water's edge, and the Japanese would say, you know, more or less picked it up. So they had no sense of orderliness at all. And I mean, if you've got men of different heights, unless they're arranged from the lowest in the front to the highest at the back, or vice versa, then everybody doesn't get a share of the load. And it's willy-nilly. They'd push people in, you'd lift the log up, and you'd find that 3 or 4 fellas would have it on their shoulders, and the others wouldn't even have the thing resting on their shoulders. And then when they got it up, they'd bash 3 or 4 blokes out and say, "Too many men," and what they thought was sufficient, and you'd have to stagger down to the road with it. And one day they told us that we were going to have a rest, that there's going to be an elephant come the next day. Well, the elephant came, but the elephant didn't go into the jungle. We had to carry it from the jungle down to the roadway, and then they harnessed the elephant